Ladies and gentlemen, the Black Tower Show. I'm your host, Nathan Ford. Jake Fox is here at BC Studios, upstate New York, broadcasting 1310 WRSB, 1590 WASB, Brockport, Canandaigua, Rochester, Buffalo, upstate New York, and it's cold and it's slushy outside. We're trying to get this conversation in with Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer, a guest on the Black Tower Show for the third time. We love talking to him, and we're talking about this Iran nuclear deal. Let's get into it. Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer.
Yeah, as I was saying, the first factor I think is it's just the Iranian program is too far developed to actually stop it unless it's dismantled in some form. The second reason why I don't think this agreement's made us any safer is because of destabilizing effect regarding the perception of it. Some countries still believe that we can stop the nuclear program. I'm not one of those that believes that. But what you have now is the Israelis, and believe it or not, the Saudi Arabians, believing that maybe military action is necessary to stop the nuclear program. And what you're seeing here now is essentially the military planning by the Israelis and Saudi Arabians, two traditional enemies, simply working together because they feel that the Iranian threat, the potential of a nuclear weapon in the hands of the Iranians is far more compelling to work together on than the issues which have kept them enemies for the past 2,000 years. So what also is happening is the Saudis have had an agreement for a while, this is not well known, for nuclear weapon support by the Pakistanis. That is to say that you all probably know the Pakistanis have their own nuclear weapons. Well, part of the money to develop those weapons back in the 80s and 90s actually came from the Saudis. The Saudis have been concerned for a while about their own ability to have their security sustained. Therefore, they've invested in this program. And now, because of this agreement, the Saudis feel that they cannot depend on us to protect them. Just letting you know the way they perceive it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying it's their perception. And therefore, there may be a nuclear arms race within the Middle East where the Saudis and other nations which are concerned about the Iranians may well arm themselves. So I would argue that the agreement, first off, is not going to really curtail the nuclear program. And secondly, I think it's added to our perception by some of our allies that they need to basically defend themselves, and it could result in a new nuclear arms race within the Middle East.
We're talking to Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer on the Black Tower Show.
The Saudis haven't exactly been responsive positively to these Iran nuclear talks, and what you said, it's understandably why. But is this rooted in a Sunni Shia type thing, and their kind of regional dominance is being threatened in that respect?
Well, absolutely. The Sunni, being essentially the Saudi-oriented sect of the faith, absolutely have seen diminishing influence in certain areas of the Middle East, specifically Iraq. The Shia, the Iranians, have been very influential and gaining more influence in Iraq. Therefore, what we've seen since our invasion of Iraq, which I think we've talked about just a bit before, basically destabilized the region by the fact that now the current government is very much pro-Iranian. They are gaining influence, and the Saudis further feel that they're being essentially encroached on by this increased Persian influence. And so what you see here is a natural reaction. The Saudis have had a very traditional sphere of influence over Iraq, over the populations within Iraq, and that is something that's resulted in, and you guys mentioned, you guys are going to talk about one of the editorials I did for FoxNews.com. One of the earlier editorials I did was something called Is Iraq Doomed?, where I outlined some of these issues. I talk about the fact that there are now, I think more than ever, the potential for a full-blown civil war in Iraq over the Sunni-Shia issues, and obviously the Saudis will do what they can to put pressure on the Iranians to back off the influence that the Iranians now have developed in Iraq, if at all possible.
Well, the Saudis have said as a result of these Iran nuclear negotiations that they will strike their own course in terms of policy. What does that mean in terms of the situation you just described?
Well, as I mentioned, regarding the overall destabilization issue, that means that they may well strike out and develop their own nuclear weapons capacity. I wouldn't say that they're going to develop their own bomb. I would say that the Saudis have developed access to nuclear weapons as they need them since they invested in the Pakistani nuclear weapons. So this is not a well-known fact either, but the Pakistanis actually have 2 brigades of military forces on call to support the Saudis if they ever need it. So there's a very strong relationship between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and needless to say that my understanding, without getting anything classified, is that there is a very strong possibility that the Pakistanis would share nuclear weapons with the Saudis if they so want them. And in this case, I think part of the Saudi policy may well be to establish nuclear weapons within the kingdom, and also the capacity to launch the weapons, which obviously having a nuclear weapon does not necessarily mean that you can use it effectively. In the case of the Saudis, they may be developing or purchasing launch delivery platforms such as missiles to be able to put nuclear weapons on. So that may be what you see coming from the Saudis.
Well, the Pakistanis reportedly already have a nuclear weapon ready to ship to the Saudis. So, I mean, this nuclearized Saudi Arabia is, I mean, it's really only a matter of time anyway, isn't it?
I predicted in a discussion the other day that we'll see a nuclear Saudi Arabia within 18 months. So we'll see if my prediction is correct or not. I would suspect it may be even sooner than that.
We're talking to Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer, former senior intelligence officer and the New York Times bestselling author of Operation Dark Heart. And it's coming out right now. You know, Iran says they're going to continue building Iraq nuclear site despite the deal. There's confusion coming out exactly what is going on with the deal. And it seems that it's just more illusion and more just shenanigans, it seems, by our government. Unfortunately, this is going to be, like you said, an actual race. And it's going to affect the people, and it's going to hurt the people, which is ultimately a problem. But let's move on to is Pentagon defending the nation or its budget? I find this very interesting story. You write... General Ray Odierno, the Army Chief of Staff, October 23rd, stated that right now we have in the Army 2 brigades that are trained. That is it, 2. And you go on in the article, and you say that this is not true, that we are ready, that there are unit status reports. That, but what it does is it kind of shows you the message that is being sent from the Obama administration, that it's not about necessarily defense, but it is about getting the money and the budget, which is an interesting sort of thing if you read into that message. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I work a lot with folks in the military still. I advise a number of folks, and one of the notable things about General Odierno's comments was, of course, he retracted them right after he said them, but very few news outlets picked up on his retraction. And the fact is this, although we are in a diminished budget environment, and I find this ironic as I say this, the percentage of growth of spending has been curtailed, not actual cuts. And so with baseline budgeting, you always start with essentially what you had the year before, and you have a certain percentage of growth. And what happened in the sequestration is that the percentage of growth was reduced across the board. Arguably, I and others have said you should not take cuts in everything. There's some things you should not cut, some things you can safely take cuts. And I've argued that that's the flaw in sequester, not that we can't sustain them. It's the method we're using. What General Odierno is basically saying is that we have to restore all cuts to the pre-sequester level, which is totally insane. We are not weak. Even if we did actually start cutting, we are still outspending every other competitor. And plus, the other folks who are outspending are our own allies, and I don't see them turning on us anytime soon. So the very premise of what General Odierno is saying, that we only have 2 brigades trained, is not only false, it's dangerous. Because there are adversaries out there who may actually believe that. The North Koreans invaded South Korea back in 1951 based on the perception that we didn't care. The Iranians, as much as we've been talking about, have proven that they will provoke things. They are not afraid of provoking international incidents, and if they think somehow that we will not respond adequately, they may do something stupid. So this is where the messaging in this sort of thing is very not only unhelpful, it actually may create in the minds of our adversaries, a perception that is completely false. We won the Cold War by essentially, basically having the Russians, the Soviets, believe that there would be huge consequences to any military action. And we, for better or for worse, spent them into oblivion. And I do believe that that's an effective way to do it. However, there was actual cuts during the Reagan years, cutting back on things we didn't need. I actually came to Washington in 1987 during a round of Reagan cuts. Basically, you could only hire individuals for everyone that retired or left the government. So we can actually be smart about budget. The Pentagon has a lot to account for. And I would argue we still are funding a 20th century Cold War infrastructure, global infrastructure, when the nature of the threat has completely changed from 1989 when the wall came down to now. And I think that's what I'm saying in my article. There are things we should be looked at. The Pentagon needs to justify whatever its budget is going to be based on real threats, something they're just not doing at this point in time.
We're talking to Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer. You go on in the article and say that the DoD should be more effective and modern. What specifically are some of the changes that you would make?
Well, three. First, they are still way behind regarding basing. We still have far too many bases and far too many places that just aren't relevant or needed. In the current war on terror, we have yet to actually reduce that footprint. So we have basically two bureaucracies that were created for different wars. The war on terror, the Cold War, all of which have pretty much wound down in some ways. I would argue the war on terror is different. It's not done, but different. And we've never really gone through and cut out what we don't need. Secondly, technology has changed the way we do business. The fact that we're having this interview right now and the way information is delivered globally has changed a lot. The Pentagon has yet to actually warm up to the idea that we live in a global environment where information travels rapidly. Internet, all these sorts of things are something they have to understand better. I would argue they've not done a good job of adapting to that. And third, I think we need to understand that the time of mass armies, large conventional military, is done. I'm not saying we don't need M1 tanks. I'm saying we don't need 300 in the desert sitting there gathering dust. So we've got to actually look at what technology we need for the 21st century. The F-35, for example, is antiquated before it rolls off the assembly line. It's going to be the first ever $1 trillion defense program, and yet there's no one who actually wants it. It's not going to do anything it's been advertised to do. And simply put, we are investing in the wrong technologies at the wrong time without understanding what exactly the threat's going to be over the next 20 to 30 years. So we actually are not using strategy to understand and to deal with what we want to buy. We're just buying technology because it seems to be benefiting certain corporations at certain times. And this is why we have to actually take a hard look at why we're funding what we're funding, what the technology is actually going to be needed to deal with adversaries, and what those adversaries actually are. Right now, it's all science fiction without a clear understanding of who our enemy is going to be, that we have to train 2 brigades to go up against.
I'd like to get your take on a situation I see brewing possibly with China. We have them completely surrounded militarily with bases and installations and things. We're encouraging Japan to form a military and army, which is against their constitution.
Right.
A couple days ago, there was a report of us flying fighter jets into Chinese airspace without any permission. We're clearly provoking China. What do you see the purpose of this is, and do you see an inevitability of an actual fight with China on some level?
The answer on the fight with China, no, not for at least 20 years, and I'll talk about that in a second. But China is clearly on the rise. They have internally, they talk about the fact that they want to reestablish the Ming Dynasty boundaries, which means that yes, indeed, they want to expand. They did lose a lot of ground to the Japanese and other nations during World War II that was never restored. So they have stated internally they're much more nationalistic than they are communist. I wouldn't even necessarily consider the Chinese communist anymore. They're just much more of almost a fascist state, if you will. And the leadership of China has said that's the direction they want to go. With that said, they have huge internal pressures which will never allow them, at least for the short term, to become a global power. They spend as much per year on finding and retaining sources of potable water for its population as they spend on their entire defense budget. That's a huge vulnerability. The fact that they have to spend as much money on defense as they do on water. So at any given time, there's a vulnerability that we could take advantage of. Second factor regarding their expansion or reemergence is the South China Sea. They are a nation of a lot of people. They need a lot of protein. So there's a great competition for fish coming out of the South China Sea that they're competing against the Philippines, Indonesia, and even the Japanese. So you see here what is developing into a war on resources. Speaking of resources, the China economy is fueled by Saudi Arabian, Iranian, and other Middle Eastern oil. All the oil comes out of the Middle East and comes to the South China Sea. So this is really going to be a fight for the South China Sea within the next decade, one which I would recommend we stay out of. I'm not saying we shouldn't have influence, but I'm saying that basically you're seeing global powers besides us who have interest in that region. And we all see the South China Sea as becoming key to that. So what I think you see here, the Chinese flexing their muscle with the interest of making sure that they can influence militarily the region. And the messaging that they're doing when they talk about these new no-fly zones, not so much for us. It's more about the Japanese, who are a natural enemy, and the Vietnamese, who are also a natural enemy. What we're seeing here is the beginning of a serious set of power plays going on in the Middle East, some of which we should be concerned about, some of which we shouldn't. But clearly, it's not really about us at this point in time. It's about the regional players in the region.
Also, China seems to be more politically unstable than the image is given to the world. They spend more on domestic security per year than they do on military spending.
Right.
So I mean, they have loads of problems, like you said. Yeah.
Well, the one-child policy has become a huge deterrent. They are going to have something called the bear tree concept may come to play, where basically you have far more males than you do females, and those males are going to want brides, and they're not going to be available to them in China. They have a problem with their economy. Not that they're not making money. They have no way to invest it. The common people like you or me who live there have no way to invest money. They make money, they have it, but it all has to be invested with the Chinese bank. And then obviously the dissident issue. I think that's been one of the things that have been most effective in downplaying. You can have protests in China as long as you get permission to have a protest. So the government is really going about trying to maintain internal security, as you mentioned. But I think all these factors, especially if they start playing off against each other, may well destabilize China to the fact it could collapse. And I know your audience may not believe this, but the Chinese could well, within the next decade, collapse unto itself based on its own internal pressures, some of which have not been fully, I think, recognized for the potential of causing their demise.
Talking to Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer, one question. I want to get your take on the UN body adopts resolution to protect individuals' universal privacy rights. You were talking about defense earlier, and people like Snowden, we talked to Thomas Drake, people that worked for the NSA. What are your thoughts on... is there an overreach? How is that needed to be changed? The way that we are watching, how Big Brother's watching over us. Yeah.
Right. Well, first off, I will say that Keith Alexander and Jim Clapper should both be fired. There's just no way that these guys should keep their jobs. They're incompetent if they don't understand the Constitution. And from the technical perspective, and I've been on the Hill meeting with members of Congress and their staffs, the NSA overreach not only is illegal constitutionally, it does not help us actually combat terror, which is the stated purpose of why they're doing it. And let me state this for your audience to understand. Any given day, there's probably 7 guys or gals that you're interested in. Out of this, we'll call them just like 7 fish. You want 7 fish, and to go out and find those fish. It's a lot easier to find 7 fish in a body of water the size of a pond than a body of water the size of the Atlantic Ocean. By what they're doing, they are creating an Atlantic Ocean size database to look for 7 fish. We've got 7 fish. They've basically created their own problems. The way they're doing it, by this bulk collection, actually increases the chances of missing something rather than finding something. Sure. And even though they argue that we're only having it just in case, there's no conceivable scenario that I'm aware of which would actually benefit from having that level of data. That level of data only benefits those who want to basically look at social trends and network issues which relate to large populations, terrorists are not a large population. So the question then becomes, why on earth would you want to retain this information, and even for any length of time? It is not legal. So based on my experience, and again, I did something called Able Danger you guys are aware of. The Able Danger tools are those which actually have been developed by NSA to use. This is not well known. Keith Alexander was the senior intelligence officer at Central Command who was one of the guys read into the program, I've come to find out. And he had a guy named Jim Heath, senior scientist at INSCOM, Intelligence Security Command, who developed the tools for Able Danger. Well, Jim Heath became Keith Alexander, senior scientist at National Security Agency when he assumed the directorship several years ago. So basically, I'm well aware of the capabilities by the fact that I was involved in some of the development of these. And I'm telling you right now, to do it the way they're doing it increases the odds of failure rather than enhances the chances of success.
Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Sure.
We'd love to have you back on the show again real soon.
Love to come back. Thanks.
You take care now.
You too.